She was 17 years old, standing outside the county land office, reading a receipt with her father's signature on it, and the number written next to her grandmother's name was $3. Not 300, not 30. 3. Cassius Vane had signed away 41 acres of creek-bottom land that belonged to his own daughter, and he'd done it standing at the counter of Halloran's dry goods store, where half the county could hear him laugh while he did it. If you've ever had someone who was supposed to protect you decide instead to humiliate you in front of everyone you know, stay until the end of this one, because 5 years is not as long as people think. And doors have a way of turning around on the people who slam them. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this one travels, and subscribe if stories like this are the kind you come back for. The morning Delphia Vane found out she'd been robbed. By her own father started out ordinary enough that she'd remember every small detail of it for the rest of her life. The way people do with mornings that turn out to matter more than they looked like they would. It was the second week of October, 1877, and the light over Colquitt Hollow had that particular flatness it got in autumn, gold at the edges but thin, like it was already saving something back for winter. Delphia had been up since before dawn, same as always, doing the milking and the mucking and the dozen other chores that fell to her, but because her father didn't rise early, and her mother had been dead 9 years. She'd finished the second cow and was carrying the pail toward the spring house when she heard a wagon on the road, moving fast, and looked up to see Otis Greer's mule cart cutting across the near pasture instead of taking the lane, which meant he was either in a hurry or wanted to be seen. Otis Greer was a landman, not a farmer, not a rancher, a man who bought and sold and speculated, who kept his eye on tax rolls and estate settlements the way other men kept their eye on weather. He was maybe 50, soft through the middle, with small, quick eyes that moved over a piece of property, the way some men's eyes moved over a horse they were thinking of buying cheap. Delphia had seen him at church twice, and disliked him both times without being able to say exactly why, beyond the fact that he looked at people the same careful, assessing way he looked at ground. He pulled the cart up near the porch, and by then Cassius Vane had come out of the house in his shirt sleeves, unshaven, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of a man managing a headache from the night before. He and Greer exchanged a few words too low for Delphia to hear from the spring house, and then they shook hands, and Greer climbed back onto his cart and drove off the way he'd come. She didn't think much of it at the time. Her father did business with a lot of men she didn't care for. That was simply the shape of her father's life since her mother died, a slow accumulating friendship with anyone who'd sit with him at the tavern in Holser's Crossing and let him complain about how the world had used him. It was 3 days later at the dry goods store that she found out what the handshake had been. She'd walked the 1.5 miles into town to trade 6 dozen eggs for coffee and thread, and she was standing at the counter waiting for Ezra Halloran to finish weighing out the coffee when she heard her father's voice from the back of the store, louder than it needed to be, the particular loudness of a man who wanted an audience and had found one. 41 acres of swamp ground, he was saying to somebody. Creek floods it every spring. Can't run cattle on it, can't hardly farm it. Old Constance left it to the girl in her will, God knows why, some notion about a woman needing her own ground. But a piece of paper don't make swamp into farmland. He laughed, that particular laugh he had that always sounded like it was daring you to disagree with him. Grier offered me $3 for it Tuesday, and I about bit his hand off taking it. Save myself the taxes. Save the girl the trouble of pretending it was ever worth anything. The store went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has just heard something they weren't supposed to hear and is deciding whether to pretend they didn't. Delphia stood very still at the counter. Ezra Halloran had stopped weighing the coffee. His eyes flicked toward her, then away, the particular carefulness of a man trying not to be the one who made this moment worse. She turned around. Her father was standing near the stove with two other men, Silas Dietz and a stranger she didn't recognize, and he had the flushed, expansive look of a man in the middle of a story he was enjoying telling. When he saw her, something in his face did a small, complicated thing, not quite guilt, not quite defiance, something in between that she would spend years afterward trying to name and never quite manage. "You sold it," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which she was grateful for later. "Delphia." He said her name the way you'd say it to head off a scene. "You sold the Hollow. Grandma's land, the land she left me. It's my right as your guardian to manage the estate until you come of age," he said, and she could hear that this was a sentence he'd rehearsed, probably in the same conversation where he'd agreed to the price. "I made a decision that was sound. That ground was worthless, Delphia. Everybody in this county knows it. I did you a favor getting rid of the tax burden before it $3. The words came out of her flat, and something about the flatness of them seemed to land harder than shouting would have. Silas Dietz looked at the floor. The stranger looked at his boots. Her father's jaw worked for a second. "Watch your tone," he said. "You sold my grandmother's land for $3, standing in this store, telling everybody it was worthless, so you could stand here and laugh about it." She looked around at the men near the stove, at Ezra Halloran still holding the coffee scale, at the two women near the fabric bolts who'd stopped pretending not to listen. "In front of the whole town, it was mine to sell. It wasn't yours at all." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she hated that it did, hated giving him even that much. "It was never yours. Grandma made sure of that. She wrote it into the will specific because she didn't trust you, and she was right not to." The color came up in her father's face, and for a second she thought he was going to hit her. Right there in Halloran's store with half the county watching, and some part of her almost wished he would, because at least then everyone would have seen it plainly instead of having to decide for themselves what they'd witnessed. But he didn't. He just stood there with his jaw tight and his hands opening and closing at his sides, and finally he said, low and mean, in a way that was somehow worse than shouting, "You'll speak to me with respect in my own town, girl, or you'll find out what disrespect costs you." She left the coffee on the counter. She left the eggs unclaimed. She walked out of Halloran's store with every eye in the place on her back, and she didn't cry until she was a quarter-mile down the road and certain nobody could see her do it. That night she sat at the kitchen table with the small tin box where she kept the things that mattered to her, her mother's locket, a pressed flower from her grandmother's funeral, the copy of the will that the county lawyer, Mr. Aldous Perrine, had given her the year her grandmother died. She read it again by lamplight, though she'd read it a dozen times before and knew most of it by heart. "To my granddaughter, Delphia Ann Vane, I leave the 41 acres known as Colquitt Hollow, together with all buildings, water rights, and improvements thereon, to be held in trust by her father until she reaches the age of 18 years, at which time full and unencumbered title shall pass to her alone, held in trust." That was the phrase Mr. Perrine had explained to her carefully the day the will was read, sitting across from her at his cluttered desk with his spectacles pushed up on his forehead. A trust means he manages it for you until you're old enough. But it isn't his to sell or give away or lose in a card game. It's yours waiting. She had believed that. She had believed it the way you believe things that seem too structurally obvious to question. The way you believe a fence will hold because someone built it and tested it and called it finished. She thought, standing at the fence that first evening after the humiliation at Halloran's about her grandmother, the way she often did when the ground under her felt uncertain. Constance Colquitt had died when Delphia was 14, 4 years after Delphia's own mother, Constance's only daughter, had died of childbed fever, bringing a second child into the world who hadn't survived the birth either. Delphia had been raised, in the years between, mostly by her grandmother, who lived close enough to walk to most days, and who had taken over without ever quite discussing it aloud. Most of the actual raising that her grief-stricken and increasingly distant son-in-law had stopped being capable of. It was her grandmother who had taught her to read a sky for weather, to keep books honestly even when the numbers were unflattering, and, most of all, to make cheese long afternoons in Constance's small stone spring house, the old woman's hands moving with the sureness of 40 years' practice while she talked, half to Delphia and half to herself, about her own mother back in the old country, and about the particular satisfaction of a process that rewarded patience and punished shortcuts in equal measure. Most things in this life, Constance had said once, cutting into a wheel that had aged exactly as long as it needed to, and not a day less. You can force if you're strong enough or clever enough. You can force a fence up faster than it ought to go, and it'll hold, mostly. You can force a harvest in early and lose some yield but still eat. But cheese won't be forced. You do the work at the start, honest and careful, and then you have to leave it alone and trust it. And there is no shortcut through that waiting that doesn't ruin the whole batch. I think that's why I love it. It's the one thing in my life that's taught me patience instead of asking me to already have it. Delphia had been 12 when her grandmother said that, too young to understand it as anything but pleasant kitchen talk. She understood it considerably better standing at the fence line of Colquitt Hollow at 18. Watching a piece of ground she couldn't get back go gray in the evening light, and thinking that whatever came next for her was going to require exactly the kind of patience her grandmother had spent years quietly teaching her. One wheel of cheese at a time, without either of them realizing it was preparation for anything larger. She went to see Mr. Perrine the next morning, walking the 2.5 miles into Holser's Crossing before the man had even opened his office, and sat on his front step, until he arrived with his key in hand, and his expression shifting from mild surprise to something more careful when he saw her face. He listened to the whole story without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that told her, before he said a word, that the news wasn't going to be what she needed it to be. A trustee has broad authority under most wills of this kind, he said finally, choosing his words with the particular slowness of a man who didn't like what he was about to say. Your grandmother's will didn't specifically prohibit sale of the property during the trust period. It only specified that full title would transfer to you at 18. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. If your father sold the land as trustee, and the transaction was properly executed, filed with the county, signed, witnessed then legally speaking, Delphia, the sale likely stands. The land wasn't yours yet, not in the eyes of the law, not until your 18th birthday. And that's 11 months away. He knew that, she said. That's why he did it now. Mr. Perrine didn't answer that directly, which was its own kind of answer. Is there anything, she said, anything I can do? You could file a complaint alleging the trustee acted in bad faith, that the sale price was so far below fair value it constitutes fraud on the beneficiary. It's possible a judge would hear that. He looked at her steadily. It's also possible that judge is Judge Alton Weathersby, who has known your father for 20 years and plays cards with him twice a month, and who is not, in my professional experience, inclined to find against men he considers his friends on the word of a 17-year-old girl. He said this gently, but plainly, the way you tell someone the truth when the kindest thing you can do is not waste their time with false hope. I would take the case if you asked me to. I want you to understand what you'd be walking into if I did. She sat with that for a long moment. Outside, a wagon passed on the street, and somewhere a dog was barking at something that didn't matter. What would it cost? She asked. The filing, I mean. If we tried anyway, he told her, and it was more than she had, more than she could hope to have before her birthday came and went, and whatever chance there was expired along with it. I'm sorry, Mr. Perrine said, and she believed that he meant it, which didn't change anything, but she believed it anyway. She walked home slowly that day, past Colquitt Hollow itself, though it wasn't on the direct road, and taking that way cost her another mile. She didn't have daylight to spare. She stood at the edge of the property for a long time, looking at the creek bottom her grandmother had loved. The willows along the water, the old spring house her grandmother had built with her own hands the year Delphia was born, back when the land had still belonged to Constance Colquitt outright, and nobody could tell her what to do with it. A woman needs her own ground, her grandmother used to say, usually while doing something practical with her hands, shelling peas or carding wool, saying it the way you say, a thing you've said 100 times because you believe it and want it repeated into somebody's memory. A woman without ground of her own is always one bad decision away from belonging to somebody else's mercy. Her grandmother had died believing she'd fix that, for one granddaughter at least. She'd died not knowing her own son-in-law would find the loophole in 11 months and sell the fix for $3 to save himself a tax bill and buy himself a good laugh at the dry goods store. Delphia stood at the fence line until the light started going, and then she turned and walked the rest of the way home, and something in her had gone very quiet and very hard by the time she got there. The particular quiet of a decision being made below the level of conscious thought, the way water decides to freeze. She stayed through the winter. There wasn't a practical alternative. Not with the ground frozen and the roads bad and nowhere in particular to go, and so she kept doing the milking and the mending and the cooking, and her father kept drinking at Holser's Crossing 3 or 4 nights a week and coming home in varying states of remorse and irritation. And the two of them existed in the house together, like two people sharing a room in an inn, polite in the way strangers are polite, careful never to let anything real pass between them. He never apologized. She hadn't expected him to, but some small stubborn part of her had hoped anyway, and the disappointment of that hope not being met sat in her like a low fever the whole season, present but manageable. Something she worked around rather than let stop her. What she did instead of hoping was plan. She had $6.40 saved from 3 years of selling eggs and preserves at the Holser's Crossing market, kept in a coffee tin buried under a floorboard in her room. Money her father didn't know existed because she'd never trusted him enough to let him know. She had her grandmother's recipe book, a worn leather-bound thing with pages soft from handling, filled with her grandmother's careful handwriting, not just cooking recipes, but the practical knowledge of 40 years of frontier life. How to render lard properly, how to smoke a ham so it kept through summer. And in the back third of the book, in ink that had faded to brown, page after page devoted to something her grandmother had learned from her own mother back in the old country before ever coming west. The making of cheese. Constance Colquitt had made cheese her whole life, small batches for the family, and sometimes enough extra to trade in town, and she'd been particular about it, in a way that Delphia, as a girl, had found tedious and only understood the value of once her grandmother was gone. And she found herself at 16, the only person left who knew how any of it was done. The temperature of the milk, the precise house moment to add the rennet, the pressing, the salting, the long patient waiting, while a wheel of cheese became, over weeks, something entirely different from what it had started as. Her grandmother used to say that cheese-making was mostly about learning to trust a process you couldn't see the middle of, that you had to do the work at the beginning and then leave it alone and believe it was becoming what you wanted it to become, even when all the evidence in front of you was just a covered pot sitting quietly in a dark room. She thought about that a great deal. That winter, sitting at the kitchen table by lamplight with her grandmother's book open in front of her. She thought, too, about the land itself, not Colquitt Hollow, which was gone, sold to Otis Greer, and beyond any hope of reclaiming, but about land in general, about what made a piece of ground valuable and what made it worthless, and about how often, in her limited experience of the world, Those two judgments turned out to have been made by people who hadn't looked closely enough. Her 18th birthday came in September. She marked it quietly, alone, since her father had forgotten it, or chosen to forget it, and 2 days later she packed a canvas bag with what she owned: the recipe book, her mother's locket, 2 changes of clothes, a wool blanket, her grandmother's cheese press, disassembled and wrapped in burlap. Because it was heavy and awkward, but she would not leave it behind, and she walked out of her father's house before he woke, leaving no note, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already gone unsaid too many times to matter now. She'd spent the summer quietly gathering information. She'd talked to the drovers who came through Holser's Crossing on their way to the rail towns further west, asking careful questions about land prices, about county tax auctions, about which counties had cheap ground and why. She'd learned that 2 counties over, in a place called Belhaven County, there was a tax sale scheduled for early October. Parcels going for the cost of back taxes owed, land nobody wanted enough to keep current on. She walked the 11 miles to the rail depot at Corning and paid for the cheapest passage west, 3rd class, sharing a hard wooden bench with a family of 5 who were themselves moving on from a farm that had failed them in ways they didn't discuss in front of a stranger, and an elderly man traveling alone who slept most of the journey with his hat pulled low and woke periodically to offer Delphia unsolicited opinions about the folly of a young woman traveling without a chaperone, opinions she received politely and ignored entirely. Somewhere past the second night, with the rail car dark and most of the other passengers asleep, the mother of the traveling family, a thin, tired woman named Ruth Halcombe, who couldn't have been much past 30, but carried herself like someone considerably older, settled into the seat across from Delphia and asked, quietly, where she was headed and why. Delphia told her more of the truth than she'd told anyone yet. The sale, the $3, the plan that was barely a plan at all. Ruth Halcombe listened without interrupting, the way people who've had their own hard year listen to somebody else's, with a particular attentive stillness that doesn't need to compare wounds to take another person's seriously. You know what my husband keeps telling the children, Ruth said when Delphia finished. Every time one of them asks why we're leaving the only home they've known, he tells them ground doesn't owe you anything just because you were born standing on it. He says the ground that's going to take care of you is usually the ground you haven't found yet. She looked out the dark window at the shapes of the country going by, invisible mostly, guessed at more than seen. I didn't used to think that was true. I thought it was just something men say when they've lost something and need a reason not to grieve it out loud. But we're 3 days from a farm that broke my husband's father and his father before him. And we're going toward ground we've never laid eyes on, and for the first time in about 2 years, I feel like I can breathe. I hope it's good ground, Delphia said. I hope yours is too. Ruth studied her for a moment in the dim light. You're young to be doing this alone. I don't have much choice in the alone part. No, Ruth agreed. Most of us don't when it comes down to it. But there's a difference between being alone because nobody wants you and being alone because you're the kind of person who can build something out of not much. I've got a feeling about which kind you are, for whatever a stranger's feeling on a train is worth. She reached over and pressed Delphia's hand briefly, the plain, unshowy gesture of a woman who had comfort to spare and no patience for making a performance of it. Good luck to you, out wherever you're headed. Parted ways. At a junction, 2 stops before Belhaven County, the Halcombe family bound further west toward a homestead claim Ruth's husband had filed on the year before. And Delphia never learned whether the ground they found took care of them the way Ruth had hoped. But she thought of that conversation often in the years that followed, the plain wisdom of a tired woman on a dark train car, and by the time she reached Belhaven County 3 days later, she had $4 and change left in her coffee tin, and a plan that amounted, honestly, to very little more than find ground, Build something. Don't ask anyone's permission first. The Belhaven County tax auction was held on the courthouse steps on a Tuesday morning in October. Cold enough that everyone's breath showed, a small crowd of maybe 30 people, mostly men, standing around in the particular loose formation of people who expect to be bored and are prepared to wait it out anyway. Delphia stood at the back in her one good dress with her canvas bag at her feet, and she watched 4 parcels sell before the one that caught her attention came up. Parcel 9, the auctioneer called, a thin, bald man with a voice like a creaking hinge. 52 acres southeast section, Miller's Run Creek frontage. Back taxes owed, $11. Note that the parcel includes a significant rock outcropping and cave system along the creek bank, described in the county survey as unsuitable for cultivation. He said this last part the way you'd read off a defect, and a couple of men near the front chuckled. Minimum bid $11 even. Nobody moved for a long moment. Delphia stood very still, thinking about her grandmother's voice, a woman without ground of her own, and thinking, too, about the word cave, which had caught in her mind the way a burr catches in wool, for reasons she couldn't yet articulate. $11, someone finally said, half-heartedly. From near the front, a man who looked like he might be bidding out of boredom more than intent. She had $4. She almost let it go. She stood there in the cold, with her canvas bag at her feet, and did the arithmetic honestly, the way her grandmother had taught her to do arithmetic honestly, even when the answer wasn't the one you wanted. And the answer was that she did not have $11. And there was no way to make $4 into 11 through wanting it hard enough. Going once, the auctioneer said. She thought of the cheese press wrapped in burlap in her bag. She thought of her mother's locket, gold, worth something to somebody, though the thought of parting with it made something in her chest close up tight. Wait, she said, and her voice came out louder than she'd meant it to in the quiet morning air, loud enough that the auctioneer paused and 30 strangers turned to look at her. I've got $4 cash, she said, walking forward, and I've got this. She pulled her mother's locket from around her neck, the one thing she truly did not want to give up, and held it out where the auctioneer could see the gold shine of it in the weak morning light. It's solid gold, and it's worth considerably more than $7 to the right buyer. I'll offer $4 cash and this locket against the parcel, and I'll ask whoever's bidding against me whether they actually want 52 acres. They've never seen described as unsuitable for cultivation, or whether they were just filling time until something better came up. There was a silence, and then the man near the front who'd made the $11 bid laughed, not unkindly, and shook his head. Lady, you can keep your locket and your worthless swampland both. I was bidding to see if anybody'd match me. I sure don't want 52 acres of rock. He tipped his hat and stepped back. The auctioneer looked at Delphia for a long moment, then at the locket, then at his ledger, doing his own arithmetic about whether the county would rather have $4 and a piece of jewelry it could sell, or hold the parcel for another year, hoping for a better offer that experience suggested probably wasn't coming. Going once, he said again, differently this time. Going twice. Sold to the young lady for $4 cash and 1 gold locket, county to assess fair value of same against the balance owed. And that was how, on a cold Tuesday morning in October of 1881, 18-year-old Delphia Vane came to own 52 acres of rock, creek frontage, and cave, in a county where she knew not one single living soul. The land, when she walked it that first afternoon, was everything the survey had promised, and worse. Miller's Run Creek cut through the property in a shallow ravine, and on the south bank, the ground rose sharply into an outcropping of pale gray limestone that the previous owners, whoever they'd been, the tax records didn't say, had apparently taken one look at and abandoned. There was no house, no barn, no fence, nothing but scrub cedar, a scatter of loose rock, and, at the base of the limestone rise, a cave mouth roughly 8 feet across, half hidden behind a fall of brush, breathing cool, damp air into the October afternoon. She stood in front of that cave mouth for a long time before she went in, the way you stand in front of any threshold that might change something in you once you cross it. Inside, the passage narrowed for the first 15 feet, low enough that she had to duck, and then opened into a chamber roughly 30 feet across, with a ceiling high enough that her lit candle, held above her head, couldn't reach it. The air was still and cool and smelled of wet stone. She'd brought a small thermometer, purchased on her way through the last town, with more of her dwindling cash than she liked spending, and she held it up in the dark chamber and waited the requisite few minutes. And when she checked it, her breath caught slightly. 54 degrees. She stood there in the candlelight, doing the calculation her grandmother's cheese book had drilled into her without ever intending to. The numbers that mattered for proper aging, cool, dark, humid, stable. The exact conditions that took most farmers years of trial and considerable expense in ice houses and root cellars to approximate, and that this cave, apparently, simply was, naturally, without anyone having to build a single thing. She sat down on a flat piece of limestone in the middle of the chamber and laughed. A short surprised sound that echoed strangely off the walls, and then she put her face in her hands and cried for the first time since she'd left her father's house, though whether it was grief or relief or something with no clean name, she couldn't have said. The next several weeks were the hardest physical labor she had ever done, and she had grown up doing farm chores from the age of 6, so that was saying something. She built a lean-to against the cave mouth, using deadfall timber and a hand axe she'd traded 3 days' labor for, with a nearby homesteader named Ida Kessler, a widow in her 60s who ran the nearest farm a mile and a half up the creek, and who had looked Delphia over with the frank assessment of someone deciding whether a stranger was worth the trouble of helping. "You're doing what exactly?" Ida had said, standing at her own fence line, arms crossed, when Delphia first came to introduce herself and ask about tool trading. "Building a cheese operation," Delphia said, "in the cave on the old Miller's Run parcel." Ida had looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not quite skeptical and not quite impressed. Something waiting in between. "That ground's been sitting empty since before my husband died, and he's been gone 6 years. I know. Nobody wanted it." "You know why nobody wanted it. Because it looks like rock and swamp, and nobody bothered to walk in far enough to find the cave," Delphia said. "Or if they did, they didn't have a use for a cave, so it didn't change their mind." Ida had studied her for another moment, and then something shifted in her face. A kind of recalculation. "You know how to make cheese?" "My grandmother taught me. She learned from her mother. I've got the recipe book, and I've got a press. What I don't have is a milk cow, or a barn, or much of anything else. How old are you?" 18, alone." "Alone," Delphia said. And something in the way she said it, plain and without self-pity, seemed to settle whatever question Ida had been turning over. "I've got a heifer coming fresh in the spring I don't especially need," Ida said, "and my husband's old tools are rusting in a shed, doing nobody any good. I'm not in the business of giving things away, understand? But I'll trade fair, and I'll tell you plain when you're about to do something foolish, because Lord knows somebody ought to." That was how Delphia acquired her first milk cow, not the spring heifer yet, but an older cow Ida sold her on credit against a promise of cheese wheels. Once production started, a debt Delphia paid faithfully over the following year, wheel by wheel, and never once late. The lean-to became a proper small cabin by December, rough but weather-tight, built against the outer face of the limestone rise so that one wall was stone and held heat from the small fireplace she constructed with flat creek stones and clay dug from the bank. She dug garden beds along the sunny stretch of ground above the creek, though nothing would go into the ground until spring. She spent the coldest months of that first winter mostly inside the cave itself, working by candlelight, mapping the chamber's dimensions, testing temperature at different points and different times, learning the place the way her grandmother had taught her to learn any process worth trusting slowly, with careful notes, without rushing to conclusions the evidence hadn't earned yet. She discovered, by February, that the chamber held steady between 52 and 56 degrees, regardless of the wild swings in outdoor temperature, that the humidity sat naturally in the range her grandmother's book called ideal for aging, and that a smaller side passage, narrower and colder, ran even more consistently near 50 degrees, nearly perfect, according to the recipe book's careful notes, for the specific hard-aged cheese her grandmother had always considered her finest work, a wheel she called simply the long cheese, because it needed the better part of a year to reach what she considered its proper character. The hardest test of that first winter came in late January, when a storm rolled through Belhaven County with a violence. The local farmers said they hadn't seen in a decade 3 days of driving snow and wind so hard it stripped bark from the smaller cedars along the creek, and temperatures that fell far enough that Delphia woke on the second morning to find the water in her wash basin frozen solid, despite the banked fire she'd kept going all night. She'd known enough by then to prepare. She'd hauled in extra firewood the week before, when the sky had first taken on the flat, heavy look her grandmother used to call the color of trouble waiting to happen. She'd moved everything movable deeper into the cave's outer chamber, where the stone held its steady temperature, no matter what chaos the sky was throwing at the surface above it. But on the second night of the storm, with the wind screaming across the ridge above her lean-to hard enough to worry her about the roof holding, she woke to a sound that didn't belong among the ordinary noises of a blizzard, a low, grinding groan from somewhere in the rock itself, followed by a distant, muffled crash that she felt through the soles of her feet before she properly heard it. She lay still in the dark for a long moment, heart going fast, trying to work out whether she'd dreamed it. Then she heard it again, smaller this time, a settling sound, stone shifting against stone somewhere deep in the passages she hadn't fully explored yet. She didn't dare go in to investigate, in the middle of a blizzard, at night alone, with a storm still raging outside, strong enough to disorient a person within a dozen yards of their own door. She spent the rest of that night sitting up by the banked fire, with her grandmother's recipe book in her lap, not reading it, just holding it, the way you hold something solid when everything else feels uncertain, running through in her mind every terrible possibility, a rockfall that had crushed her aging shelves, a collapse that had sealed off the deeper chambers she'd only begun to map, the entire foundation of the plan she'd staked her whole remaining life on turning out in one violent night, to have been standing on ground no sounder than the swamp everyone had called Colquitt Hollow. When the storm finally broke on the third morning, she went in with a lantern held high and her heart in her throat, and found, to her enormous relief, that the sound had come from a section of loose shale near the cave's outer wall, a natural shelf that had simply given way under the accumulated weight of frost expansion over the winter, collapsing into a shallow rubble pile that blocked nothing, threatened nothing, and had happened a good 20 feet from where any of her shelves or supplies were stored. The chambers deeper in were untouched, steady and cool and dark exactly as they'd always been, indifferent to whatever violence the surface world had endured. She sat down on a flat stone in the outer chamber and laughed the same short, surprised laugh she'd laughed the first day she'd measured the temperature in that cave, and understood, sitting there, something about the whole enterprise she hadn't fully grasped until that moment of fear and relief that she had chosen, whether she'd known it or not, to build her entire future on the one part of the landscape that didn't answer to weather, didn't care about blizzards or drought or any of the violent unpredictability that governed everything happening above ground. The cave had been indifferent to the storm, the same way it would eventually prove indifferent to market panics and bad harvests and every other kind of chaos that ruined ordinary farmers in ordinary years. It simply held its temperature, in the dark patiently, the way her grandmother had always said the good things worth trusting eventually would. By the time the first heifer freshened in April and Delphia had her first real milk to work with, she had spent 5 months learning every inch of that cave the way another person might learn a language, and she began her first batch of cheese with the particular careful confidence of someone who has done all the preparation the situation allows and is now simply going to trust the process the way her grandmother had taught her. Even though all the evidence in front of her, for weeks afterward, was nothing but a covered wheel sitting quietly in the dark. The first year was mostly failure, though not the kind that discourages a person who has already decided failure isn't a reason to stop. Her first 3 batches of cheese came out wrong in 3 different ways: too dry, too soft. One ruined outright by a contamination she eventually traced to unclean cloth she'd used for pressing. She kept careful notes in the back of her grandmother's book, the way her grandmother had taught her, writing down what she'd done and what had happened and what she thought had gone wrong, building, wheel by wheel, a working knowledge that no book alone could have given her. Ida Kessler came by every few weeks, ostensibly to check on the heifer she still had partial claim to, but really, Delphia understood by summer, to check on her. "You're stubborn," Ida said one afternoon in June, standing in the cave chamber looking at the row of aging wheels on their shelves Delphia had built from split cedar logs set into gaps in the limestone. I mean that as an observation, not necessarily a compliment yet. We'll see which one it turns out to be. "My grandmother was stubborn," Delphia said. "She built a whole life on being stubborn in a direction nobody else thought made sense. And you're doing the same thing. I'm doing the only thing I know how to do that felt like it belonged to me." Ida looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and pressed her thumb gently against the rind of the nearest wheel, testing it the way a person tests a thing they've handled 1,000 times before, though Delphia knew for a fact Ida had never made cheese in her life. "This one smells right," Ida said. "I don't know what right smells like exactly, but this smells like something that knows what it's supposed to become." It was the 4th batch. The one Delphia had started in March using milk from the second cow, a proper milk cow she'd finally been able to purchase outright after selling her mother's locket's replacement value in trade credit, a small, painful transaction she'd made peace with by reminding herself, as her grandmother might have, that a locket was a memory and a cow was a future. And a person building something from nothing sometimes had to choose between the two that finally came out the way the recipe book promised it should. She cut into the wheel in September, 6 months after starting it, in the cave chamber by lamplight with Ida standing beside her, because Delphia had asked her to be there, some instinct telling her this moment shouldn't happen entirely alone. The interior was pale gold, close-textured, with the faint, crumbling character her grandmother's notes described as the mark of proper aging. And when Delphia cut a small piece and handed it to Ida, and then took a piece herself, the taste that filled her mouth was sharp and nutty and complex in a way that the earlier failed batches had never come close to, a taste that carried unmistakably specific character her grandmother used to describe with a particular satisfied nod, the nod that meant a thing had turned out exactly as intended. "Well," Ida said slowly, chewing. Her eyebrows going up in a way that Delphia had learned over the past year meant Ida was genuinely surprised and trying not to show too much of it. "Well, is it good?" "Delphia, I have eaten cheese my whole life on a dairy farm in 3 different states, and this is better than anything I've had that didn't come off a boat from somewhere expensive." Ida looked at her directly. "You need to take this to market. The nearest town of any real size was Corning, the rail depot 14 miles east, and Delphia made the trip with 4 finished wheels loaded carefully into a borrowed cart borrowed from Ida, along with Ida's mule. A loan given with the particular gruffness of someone who wanted to help but didn't especially want to be thanked for it. And she went first to the general store, where a man named Marcus Boyle ran the only grocery of any size in town. Boyle was a heavy-set man with a permanent look of mild disappointment, and he examined the wheel of cheese she set on his counter with the flat, unimpressed expression of a man who had been offered a great many things by a great many hopeful strangers and had learned not to get excited early. What's this supposed to be? Aged hard cheese. A year in the making, cave-aged on Miller's Run. He raised an eyebrow. Cave-aged. He said it the way you'd say a word you suspected was being used to dress something up. You mean you left it in a hole in the ground? I mean, I built an operation around a natural limestone cave that holds a steady 52 to 56 degrees and proper humidity year-round, which is exactly the aging environment the finest cheeses in Europe are made in, minus the enormous expense most operations spend building artificial versions of the same thing. She kept her voice level, matter of fact, the way she'd practiced in her head on the ride in. Try it before you decide what it is. Boyle cut a small piece with obvious skepticism, and Delphia watched his face do the same thing Ida's had done, the surprised recalibration of a man tasting something better than he'd expected to. Huh, he said. I've got 3 more wheels like it, and I can bring more through the winter. And I'd like to talk about a standing arrangement if the quality holds, which it will, because I know exactly what conditions produce this, and I can produce it again. Boyle looked at her for a long moment, a girl of 19 standing in his store in a plain traveling dress with mud on her boots, talking about standing arrangements like she'd been running a business for 20 years. How much? He said finally. She named a price she'd calculated carefully on the ride in, high enough to be worth the labor, low enough to seem reasonable against the fine imported cheeses he likely stocked for the wealthier families in town. He haggled, mildly, out of habit more than conviction, and they settled on a number that put more cash in Delphia's coffee tin that single afternoon than she'd earned in the entire previous year combined. The confidence she carried into Boyle's store that day had been hard-won, and it had nearly been undone entirely by a crisis that struck midway through her second year, one she rarely spoke about afterward because remembering it still made her stomach tighten even once it was long resolved. She'd begun, by her second spring, aging 9 wheels simultaneously across 2 chambers, a scale that felt ambitious and slightly frightening after a first year spent mostly failing at single batches. 6 weeks into the aging process, she went in for her regular inspection and found, on 3 of the 9 wheels, a bloom of blue-gray mold spreading across the rind in a pattern her grandmother's book didn't describe anywhere in its careful, handwritten pages, not the pale. Even coding that meant a wheel was developing properly, but something darker, patchier, accompanied by a smell that made her stomach turn the moment she leaned close to check it. She sat on the cave floor with the ruined wheels in front of her and felt something close to panic for the first time since she'd arrived in Belhaven County. Not the sharp, immediate fear of the storm, but a slower, colder kind. The recognition that 6 weeks of milk, 6 weeks of labor, and a third of everything she'd built toward that season might be lost, and that she had no earthly idea why, which was worse than the loss itself, because a mistake she understood she could correct, and a mistake she couldn't explain might simply happen again. She rode to Ida Kessler's place that same afternoon with one of the ruined wheels wrapped in cloth in her saddlebag and found Ida in her garden and held it out without preamble. Something's gone wrong and I don't know what. Ida unwrapped it, looked at it, smelled it, and her face went thoughtful rather than alarmed, which steadied Delphia slightly before a word had been said. When did you last replace the cloths you press with? I've been using the same 3 since I started, just washing them between batches, boiling them, or just washing. Delphia's stomach dropped as she understood before Ida even finished the thought, exactly what the answer meant. Just washing, in creek water. There's your trouble, most likely, Ida said. Cloth holds onto things water alone won't chase out, especially cloth that's touched milk and cheese 100 times over. You've probably been carrying something in that fabric for months that only just built up enough to cause real trouble. My mother used to boil her pressing cloths every single batch, no exceptions. Said it was the one shortcut that always came back to bite you eventually, if you took it. She handed the ruined wheel back. It's not your recipe, it's not your cave, it's your cloth. That's a fixable problem, and a cheap one, compared to what you're probably imagining right now. Delphia went home and boiled every piece of cloth she owned that touched milk or curd, replaced the oldest and most worn of them outright, and started her next batch with a discipline about cleanliness that bordered, Warren Tuck would later joke, on the religious. The remaining 6 wheels from that troubled season aged clean and sound. She lost the 3, a real loss, weeks of milk and labor she couldn't recover, but she wrote the whole episode carefully into the back of her grandmother's recipe book, the way she wrote every failure, with the date and the cause and the fix, so that the knowledge, once purchased at that particular cost, would never need purchasing twice. It was the last serious failure the operation ever suffered. Word traveled the way word travels in small counties, faster than seemed reasonable, and always slightly distorted by the time it arrived. By the following spring, Delphia had a standing order with Boyle's store and a second, smaller arrangement with a hotel dining room, 2 towns over, that catered to rail travelers with money and a taste for something better than the usual fare. She'd hired her first hand that same spring, a boy of 15 named Warren Tuck, whose family had more children than land, to help with the milking and the fence work and the dozen daily tasks that had grown beyond what one person could manage alone. Not everyone in the county was pleased about it. Cyrus Belhaven, no relation to the county's name, a coincidence he mentioned often enough that people suspected he wished. There were one ran the largest dairy operation in the area, a proper barn and pasture set up, with 30 head of cattle and a hired crew. He had, Delphia gathered from the way people talked around her, never much cared for the idea of a girl running an operation out of a hole in a hillside, undercutting the market he considered his by right of size and seniority. He came to see her directly in the summer of her 2nd year, riding up the creek trail on a good horse, dressed like a man who wanted his prosperity noticed. "Miss Vane," he said, not dismounting, looking down at her from the saddle in a way that felt deliberate. "I hear you've been selling cheese to Boyle's store." "I have." "I hear he's been asking my regular customers whether they've tried the cave cheese." His mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "You understand there's a limited market in a county this size, and I've spent 15 years building mine honestly, buying good stock, doing things properly. I don't much care for someone coming in from another county and undercutting years of work with a novelty." "It's not a novelty," Delphia said. "It's a different product, aged a different way, and if your customers prefer it, that's a fact about the cheese, not a trick I'm playing on them. A girl alone in a cave," he said, and this time the not-quite smile was closer to a sneer. "Folks find that story charming for a season. Novelties don't last, Miss Vane. Real operations do. I've been here 2 years, Delphia said. I intend to be here in 20 more. If my cheese is still selling then, I expect you'll have stopped calling it a novelty." He looked at her for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes. And then he turned his horse and rode off without another word, and Delphia stood at her fence line and watched him go, and felt something settle into place in her that hadn't been entirely settled before the understanding that she was now, in the eyes of at least one man in this county, a competitor worth being irritated by, which meant, by the only measure that mattered, that she'd already succeeded more than he wanted to admit. The competition between them simmered for the better part of 2 years, mostly in small ways, Belhaven undercutting her price. At Boyle's store one season, Delphia's cheese quietly outselling his at the hotel dining room the next, both of them polite in public and pointed in the specific, careful way that people in small counties learn to be pointed without ever technically saying anything actionable. It resolved in the end, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the ordinary passage of time and reputation. By her 4th year, Delphia's cheese had won a modest blue ribbon at the regional agricultural fair, judged blind by 3 men who didn't know whose product they were tasting until the ribbons were already pinned, and Cyrus Belhaven, standing in the crowd when her name was announced, had the good grace, or perhaps simply the good sense, to come find her afterward and shake her hand. "I was wrong that it was a novelty," he said plainly, without excessive ceremony, the way a man says a thing he's decided to say and wants to get through cleanly. "I've eaten better cheese from your cave than from operations twice the size of mine." I don't say that easily, but it's true, and I'd rather say it than keep pretending otherwise. "I appreciate that," Delphia said, and meant it, and that was the end of the rivalry. More or less not friendship exactly, but the particular mutual respect of 2 people who'd measured each other honestly and come to honest conclusions. By that point, she had 3 hired hands, 12 head of dairy cattle, a proper barn built the previous fall, and a growing shed of aging cheese wheels that stretched now into 3 separate chambers of the cave system, having discovered, through patient exploration over her 3rd year, that the cave ran considerably deeper than she'd first realized, with at least 2 additional chambers suitable for aging, each with slightly different temperature and humidity characteristics that she'd learned, through careful experimentation, produced subtly different and equally valuable results. She had also, by then, bought back her mother's locket, tracked down through the same trade credit network she'd sold it into, at considerable and deliberate expense, because some things, once you have the means, are worth paying to reclaim. The operation Delphia Vane built over 5 years on 52 acres that the Belhaven County tax rolls had once described as unsuitable for cultivation became, by the autumn of 1886, something that people in 3 counties had heard of by name: Vane Cave Cheese. The crates read when they went out by rail to markets as far as the state capital, and the wheels inside them commanded prices that would have seemed to the 18-year-old girl who'd traded a locket and $4 for 52 acres of rock entirely impossible to believe. She employed 5 hands by then, 3 men and 2 women, paid fair wages on a regular schedule, a policy she'd been particular about from the beginning, having not forgotten what it felt like to have her own labor undervalued by someone with power over her. She had built a proper house above the cave entrance, timber frame, sound, with real glass windows, and a stove that drew clean, a house that bore almost no resemblance to the rough lean-to she'd started in, though she'd kept that first small structure standing at the edge of the property, unused now, as a kind of marker of where she'd begun. She had never married, though not for lack of opportunity. A few reasonable men in the county had made their interest known over the years, and she'd considered 2 of them seriously enough to spend real time weighing the question, before deciding, each time, that she wasn't yet finished building the thing she'd started, and didn't want to divide her attention while she was still in the middle of it. She thought, sometimes, that this might change eventually. She wasn't in any particular hurry about it either way. She had written to Mr. Aldous Perrine, the lawyer back in Holser's Crossing, twice over the years, once to tell him simply what had become of her, because he'd been kind to her when kindness cost him nothing but time, and once, 2 years later, to ask a careful, businesslike question about whether it might be possible to make a formal offer to purchase Colquitt Hollow back from Otis Grier, should Grier ever be inclined to sell. Mr. Perrine's reply to the second letter had informed her, with evident and carefully worded regret, that Otis Greer had let the property go tax delinquent within 18 months of acquiring it, never having done a single thing with the ground beyond own it, and that it had eventually been auctioned off itself, purchased by a farming family from 2 counties over who'd since drained the worst of the flood-prone bottomland and were running a modest but functional operation on it. The hollow, in other words, was gone in every sense that mattered, not stolen from her anymore. Exactly, but simply passed on, absorbed into someone else's ordinary life. The specific wrong of it dissolved into the ordinary churn of land changing hands, the way land always eventually does. She had read that letter sitting at her own kitchen table, in her own house, on land she had found and claimed and built entirely with her own 2 hands and her grandmother's patient knowledge. And she had felt, reading it, something more complicated than grief and less simples than relief, a kind of settling, maybe. The recognition that the hollow had been the wound but never the cure, that whatever she'd built since had never actually depended on getting it back. She thought about her father sometimes, though less often than she once had, and always with the same flat, careful distance she'd learned to hold around the subject the way you hold your hand carefully around an old injury that's mostly healed but still tender in certain weather. She'd heard, through the loose network of gossip that traveled between counties along with drovers and rail passengers and traveling salesmen, that his farm had struggled in the years since she left, that his drinking had gotten worse rather than better, that he'd taken out debts against the land itself to cover losses, and that those debts had a way, everyone said, of eventually coming due. She hadn't gone looking for that news. It had found her the way news does, in fragments, second-hand, and she'd received each fragment with the same careful neutrality, filing it away, without letting it change the shape of the life she'd built, which had, by then, very little room left in it for her father at all, which was, in its own way, exactly why what happened next landed as hard as it did. The hardest season the operation faced in its first 5 years came not from weather violence, but from its opposite, a drought in the summer of 1885 that settled over Belhaven County in June and simply refused to break, week after rainless week, until the creek that had once run steady past Delphia's cave dropped to a thin trickle threading between exposed gravel bars, and the pastures that fed her growing herd browned and thinned until Warren Tuck was walking the fence lines twice a day, calculating, with visible worry, how many more weeks the grazing would hold. It was the kind of drought that hurt everyone in the county roughly equally, which meant it hurt some considerably worse than others, since equal hardship never lands equally on people who started from different footing. Cyrus Belhaven's operation, larger and better capitalized, had a proper well and reserve feed stores that carried him through with only moderate strain. Smaller operations up and down Miller's Run had no such cushion, and by August Delphia was hearing, with increasing frequency, about neighbors selling off stock at a loss simply because they couldn't feed what they had, families packing up claims that had held for a decade or more because one dry summer had finally made the arithmetic impossible. Delphia's own herd was young enough and her operation lean enough that she felt the pinch severely. The cave itself remained, as it always had, entirely indifferent to the drought. The temperature and humidity inside those stone chambers didn't fluctuate with rainfall, and her aging wheels continued their patient, unhurried transformation exactly as scheduled. A fact that struck her, in the middle of that anxious summer, as one of the strangest comforts she'd ever experienced, that the one part of her life most exposed to catastrophe 5 years earlier had become the one part now entirely shielded from it. But cheese needed milk before it could age, and milk needed grass and water, and by late July she was faced with a choice that kept her awake several nights running. Cull part of her herd to preserve feed for the rest, or gamble on the drought breaking, before her reserves ran out entirely. It was Ida Kessler, older now and slower but no less sharp, who came to her with the solution that ultimately saved the season, riding up the creek trail one morning with an expression of grim practical purpose. "There's an old spring line on the back 40 of my property that hasn't run in 15 years, Ida said, without preamble, the way she delivered most important information. "My husband always said it would run again in a wet enough year. And I never had reason to test the theory because we've never had a dry enough year to need it, and a wet enough year to prove it since he passed. But I got to thinking about your cave, and about how you found water where nobody thought to look for it. And I went and dug in that old spring bed myself yesterday morning with a shovel and my own 2 stubborn hands, and there's damp ground down there, Delphia. Not flowing yet, but damp 8 feet down. I think there's water under that ground the drought hasn't reached." The two of them spent the better part of a week working that old spring bed together, along with Warren and 2 of Ida's own hired men, digging by hand in the brutal August heat, deepening and clearing what turned out to be an old natural seep that had simply silted shut over 15 years of neglect. On the 6th day, working nearly 10 feet down, they broke through into a slow but steady flow of cool, clean water rising from some deeper aquifer that the surface drought hadn't touched at all. The same principle. Delphia realized standing in that muddy hole, with water rising steadily around her boots, that had made her cave possible in the first place. The ground held resources the surface didn't show you, if you were willing to dig deep enough and patient enough to find them. They ran a simple gravity line from the new spring down to a holding trough on Delphia's property. Enough supplemental water to carry both operations' herds through the worst of the dry months, and word of the discovery spread through the county the way any piece of genuinely useful news spreads in a hard season, with real gratitude, and no small amount of surprise that it had been 2 women, one of them past 60 and the other not yet 25, who'd solved a problem that had stumped every man in the valley for a decade and a half. Cyrus Belhaven himself came by that September, after the rains had finally returned and the immediate crisis had passed, not to gloat or diminish what they'd done, but, in his characteristically blunt way, to acknowledge it plainly. "I've got a proper well and money enough to weather most anything," he said, standing at her fence line much as he had years before, though his tone now carried none of the old condescension. "I didn't think to help anybody else through this summer because I didn't have to think about it. You and Ida Kessler dug water out of ground everybody else had given up on, same as you dug a fortune out of a cave everybody else called worthless. And I'll say plainly, Miss Vane, that I've stopped being surprised by what you find in ground other people have quit looking at too closely." He tipped his hat, an actual gesture of respect this time, unforced. "There's men in this county twice your age who could learn something from watching how you work." Delphia thanked him, and meant it, and thought, watching him ride off, that the drought summer had taught her something she hadn't fully understood even after 4 years of steady success, that the thing her grandmother had built into her, the habit of looking patiently at ground, other people had already decided wasn't worth the trouble, wasn't a trick that worked once by luck. It was a way of seeing the world that kept working, season after season, crisis after crisis, as long as she stayed willing to dig. What Delphia didn't know that morning, and wouldn't learn the fuller shape of until much later, secondhand, pieced together over years from the kind of fragments that eventually reach everyone in a small enough world, was the actual accounting of what those 5 years had done to her father. The land itself, what remained of it, after Colquitt Hollow was gone, had never been large to begin with, and Cassius Vane had never been the kind of farmer who compensated for thin acreage with careful management. The drinking that had been a Friday and Saturday habit while Delphia still lived under his roof became, in the 2 years after she left, something closer to a daily fact of his life, and the debts that habit generated compounded quietly against a farm that was already producing less than it needed to. He'd mortgaged what he could, borrowed against a harvest that came in poor 2 years running, and by the spring of 1885, the same spring Delphia and Ida Kessler were digging a 15-year dormant spring out of drought-cracked ground. 2 counties over the bank in Holser's Crossing had finally run out of patience and taken the farm entire. He'd spent the 18 months since doing exactly what he'd told her at her doorway. Day labor wherever a man his age with a bad reputation and a worse hip could find it. Sleeping some nights in barns offered out of charity and other nights in whatever shelter the weather allowed. Watching, from that considerably lower vantage, the particular cruelty of a county that remembered every loud, careless thing he'd ever said in Halloran's store, and had no special mercy stored up for him now that his circumstances had reversed. Nobody in Holser's Crossing had gone out of their way to help Cassius Vane find steady work. He had, by his own later admission to Delphia, spent a good deal of those 18 months turning the whole arc of it over in his mind, the $3, the laugh, the daughter he'd humiliated in front of the whole town, and arriving, slowly, and without the comfort of any easy excuse, at the plain conclusion that he had done this to himself, that whatever mercy the world was declining to extend him now was mercy he had spent 5 years earlier making sure he'd never be owed. He'd heard about Vane Cave cheese the way he heard about most things by then, in fragments passed along rail platforms and general stores, a name that had traveled well beyond Belhaven County's borders by 1886, though it had taken him longer than it should have to connect the operation's name to the daughter he hadn't seen or written to in 5 years, mostly because some part of him, he admitted much later, hadn't wanted to let himself hope that connection was real, in case hoping and being wrong turned out to be one more thing he couldn't survive. It was a stranger in a Corning boarding house in October of 1886 who finally said the name plainly enough that he couldn't avoid the truth of it any longer, a drover mentioning, over a shared supper table, that the best cheese he'd eaten in 3 states came out of a cave on Miller's Run by a young woman named Vane who'd started with nothing and built the whole operation herself. Cassius Vane had sat very still at that table, his spoon halfway to his mouth, and understood, all at once, exactly whose daughter that was, and exactly what he was going to have to do about it, whether or not he had any right left to expect it would go well. It was late October, 5 years almost, to the week since she'd stood outside the county land office, reading a receipt with $3 written on it, and the light over Belhaven County had that same particular thin gold quality that autumn light always seemed to carry. The same season, the same slant, though everything else about her life had changed entirely in the years between. She was in the barn that morning, going over the week's production numbers with Warren Tuck, no longer the 15-year-old boy who'd been her first hire, but a grown man of 20 now, married the previous spring, still working for her because, as he put it, there wasn't a better operation in 3 counties to work for, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. When one of the younger hands, a girl named Susan Pruitt, came to find her with a look on her face that said something out of the ordinary had happened. "There's a man at the house asking after work," Susan said. "Says he heard the operation was hiring. Doesn't look like he's had an easy stretch of it." Delphia wiped her hands on her apron and walked up from the barn toward the house. Not thinking much of it beyond mild curiosity, she did occasionally hire drifters for seasonal labor, men working their way west or south looking for whatever paid, and the description fit that pattern well enough that she wasn't expecting anything unusual. She came around the corner of the house and stopped. He was standing near the porch steps, hat in his hands, and he had aged more than 5 years, should have aged him thinner than she remembered, his hair gone mostly gray at the temples, his clothes worn in the particular way of a man who'd been wearing the same few garments too long without the means to replace them. He hadn't seen her yet. He was looking at the house, at the barn, at the cave entrance visible up the rise, with an expression she recognized even across the distance and even after 5 years, because it was the same expression half the county had worn when they first saw the operation and understood, all at once, that the thing everyone had written off as worthless swampland had become something they'd been wrong about. Then he turned, and he saw her, and Delphia watched her father's face go through several things, in rapid succession confusion, then dawning recognition, then something that looked, for just a moment, like naked shock, before he managed to arrange his features into something more composed. "Delphia," he said. She stood very still. Somewhere behind her she could hear Susan and Warren, who had followed her up from the barn, going quiet, understanding without being told that they'd walked into something that wasn't theirs to be part of. "I heard there was work," Cassius Vane said. His voice had none of the loud confidence she remembered from Halloran's store 5 years before. It came out smaller, careful, the voice of a man who'd rehearsed a sentence and found it harder to say than he'd expected. "I heard the operation on Miller's Run was hiring hands for the season. I didn't know." He stopped. His eyes moved over her face, over the house behind her, over the whole obvious evidence of what she'd built. And something in his expression cracked open in a way she'd never seen it crack before, not once in 18 years of living under his roof. "I didn't know it was you." "You're looking for work," she said. Her voice came out flatter and steadier than she felt. "The farm's gone," he said. "Bank took it in the spring." "I've been—" He stopped again, and she watched him decide, visibly, whether to lie about the intervening months or tell the truth, and something in him, whatever was left of the man who used to be able to talk his way past any inconvenient fact, seemed to have worn away enough that the truth came out instead. "I've been doing day labor where I can find it. It hasn't been much. I heard in Corning that a cheese operation on Miller's Run was paying fair and hiring steady, and I came to ask, and I didn't—" His voice caught, just slightly, and he had to stop and start again. "I didn't know it was your operation. I want you to know that. I wasn't coming here to ask you for anything special. I was coming here the same as any man looking for work would." Delphia looked at him for a long time. Behind her she was aware of Warren and Susan standing very still, and beyond them, faintly, the ordinary sounds of the operation continuing, a cow lowing somewhere, the creak of the barn door, the whole functioning machinery of the life she'd built entirely without him, in spite of him, because of what he'd taken from her and what she'd refused to let that taking become the end of. "Do you know what this land was?" she said finally. "When I bought it." He shook his head slightly, not understanding the question. 52 acres of rock and cave that the tax rolls said was unsuitable for cultivation. Nobody wanted it. I bought it with $4 and my mother's locket because it was all I had left after you sold my inheritance for $3 standing in Halloran's store, telling the whole town it was worthless while you laughed about it. She said this plainly, without raising her voice, the way you state a fact that has long since stopped needing to be shouted to carry its full weight. I built this from nothing you gave me. Every wheel of cheese aging in that cave, every cow in that barn, every wage I pay these 2 people standing behind me, none of it exists because of anything you did. It exists because you took away the thing I thought I could count on, and I had to learn, the hard way, at 18 years old, alone in a county where I didn't know a single soul, that I couldn't count on anything except what I built myself. Her father stood there and took this, his hat still in his hands, his eyes fixed on her, and he didn't argue, didn't offer the excuses she half expected, the ones he'd offered 5 years ago about trustees' rights and sound decisions and tax burdens. He just stood there and let the words land, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "I know," he said. "I've had 5 years to think about that morning, Delphia, and there isn't a version of what I said or what I did that I can make sound like anything other than what it was. I was cruel to you because I could be, and because it made me feel something other than useless for an afternoon, and I have thought about that morning more times than I could count, and every time I think about it, it looks worse, not better." He stopped, and his voice, when he continued, had gone rougher. "I'm not asking you for family. I gave that up the day I did what I did, and I know it, and I'm not fool enough to walk up to your door after 5 years and ask you to forget it. I'm asking if you've got work. That's all. If you don't, I'll walk on and you'll never see me again. And I won't hold that against you for 1 minute, because you'd have every right." The barn cow lowed again somewhere behind the house. The wind moved through the cedars along the creek. Delphia stood on her own porch, on ground she had found and claimed and shaped, with 5 years of her own patient labor, and looked at the man who had once had the power to determine everything about her life, standing now with his hat in his hands, asking her plainly for something as small as a day's wage. "I don't hire family favors," she said finally. "If you work here, you work the same as everyone else. Fair wage, honest hours, and if your work isn't good enough, you're let go same as anybody else would be. I won't carry you out of guilt, and I won't punish you out of spite either, because I've got no more patience for either of those than I do for the man who did what you did 5 years ago. You'll be a hand. Nothing more, nothing less, until you show me otherwise. That's more than I have any right to expect," her father said quietly. "It's not generosity," Delphia said. "It's the same offer I'd make anybody who walked up that road looking for honest work. You don't get special treatment for being my father. You also don't get turned away for it." She looked at him for one more long moment. "Warren will show you where to put your things. You'll bunk with the other hands. Milking starts at 5. She turned and walked back down toward the barn without waiting to see his response, because there was nothing more to say that the terms she'd laid out hadn't already covered, and because some part of her needed, badly, to be back among the ordinary tasks of the operation she'd built, the milking and the checking of the aging wheels and the small daily proofs that the life she'd made was real and solid and entirely her own, before she let herself feel whatever it was she was going to feel about the fact that her father was now, of all the strange turns a life could take, one of her hired hands. Cassius Vane worked at Vane Cave Cheese for the better part of 6 years, until age and a bad hip finally slowed him past the point of useful labor. He was never, in all that time, anything more than what Delphia had promised him. He'd be a hand, paid fair, treated the same as everyone else, no closer to her than the other workers, and, for a long while, considerably more distant, since the other hands hadn't grown up watching him drink away an evening's temper on whoever was nearest. But something did shift, slowly. The way most real things shift, not through any single dramatic reconciliation, but through the accumulated evidence of years. He worked hard, honestly, without complaint, at tasks far beneath what he'd once considered his station. He never once, in 6 years, asked for more than his wage or better treatment than anyone else received. He was, by the 3rd year, the first one, up most mornings, working the milking, before the younger hands had even stirred, as though some part of him understood that he had a debt of a different kind to pay that money alone wouldn't settle, and that the only currency available to him now was simply showing up day after day and doing the work in front of him without complaint. Delphia watched this happen with the same careful, unsentimental attention she brought to everything, neither rushing toward forgiveness nor holding herself rigidly against it, letting the years do whatever work they were going to do at their own pace. By the 4th year, she found herself occasionally sitting with him during the evening meal the hands shared together. Not as father and daughter exactly, but as two people who worked the same ground and had, slowly, without either of them announcing it, begun to find something like ordinary ease in each other's company. He never once brought up the morning at Halloran's store again, and neither did she, though it sat between them always, an old wound that had scarred over without ever fully vanishing, the kind of thing you learn to live alongside rather than the kind that ever entirely disappears. He died in the winter of 1893 of a fever that took him quickly, and Delphia buried him on a rise above the creek within sight of the cave that had become, by then, the thing his own cruelty had inadvertently made possible, because if he had not sold Colquitt Hollow for $3, she often thought afterward, she would likely never have left, never have walked into a Belhaven County tax auction with $4 and a locket, never have found the cave, never have built any of it. It was not a thought that excused what he'd done. She never let herself believe that. But it was a thought that sat honestly alongside the grief, the way true things sometimes do, complicated and unclean and entirely real. Vein Cave Cheese continued for another 30 years under Delphia's management, and another 20 after that, under the management of Susan Pruitt's daughter, who Delphia trained personally over the last decade of her working life, having never married or had children of her own, choosing instead to pass the operation to the people who'd built it alongside her, rather than to blood she didn't have. The cave itself is still there, on what is now protected agricultural land in Belhaven County, and the small stone marker near the original lean to Delphia, never tore down, reads simply, "Constance Colquitt taught her granddaughter that a woman needs ground of her own." Her granddaughter found it in a hole, in a hillside that everyone else called worthless, and built something that outlasted every person who ever doubted her. It is not, by most measures, a large monument. It never needed to be. Susan Pruitt's daughter, a woman named Charlotte, who took over full management of the operation in 1919 at the age of 31, kept Delphia's original ledgers and recipe notes carefully preserved in a fireproof box in the cave's outer chamber. And she used to tell visitors the operation drew a fair number of curious travelers by then. Word of the cheese cave of Miller's Run, having spread well beyond the county's borders over the decades, that the most valuable thing in the whole operation wasn't the cave itself, remarkable as it was, but the handwriting in those old books. Page after page of careful notes in Delphia's steady hand, every failure recorded honestly alongside every success. The batch that spoiled from unboiled cloth sitting right there in the record, next to the batch that won a blue ribbon. Because Delphia had never believed in hiding the failures that taught her something worth keeping. Charlotte liked to read one particular passage aloud to visitors, written in the back pages sometime in Delphia's later years, in handwriting grown slightly less steady with age, but no less clear in its meaning. People will tell you a thing is worthless because they looked at it once, from the road, without getting out of the wagon. Most of what's actually valuable in this world is sitting somewhere nobody bothered to walk into. My grandmother taught me that with cheese, and my father taught me the opposite lesson without meaning to, and between the two of them, I learned everything I ever needed to know about how to spend a life. The operation is smaller now than it was at its height in the 1920s, run these days by a cooperative of local families, rather than any single owner, but the cave still ages cheese the same patient way it always has, indifferent to whatever chaos the surface world is enduring in any given season, and the stone marker still stands near the original lean-to, weathered but legible. The words Delphia chose herself in the last years of her life, plain and unadorned the way she'd always preferred things. Constance Colquitt taught her granddaughter that a woman needs ground of her own. Her granddaughter found it in a hole in a hillside that everyone else called worthless, and built something that outlasted every person who ever doubted her. The cheese still aging in that cave, generation after generation, batch after patient batch, has always said everything that needed saying about what $4, a locket, and a refusal to believe what other people called worthless could, given 5 years and enough stubbornness, eventually become.